Imagine this. You've saved for a dream trip to Tokyo, hotels booked, tickets bought, and then, overnight, your airline app flashes a red banner. All flights to Japan can be canceled for free due to new guidance from Beijing. There is no war, no missiles, no breaking news of invasion, just a travel warning. Yet that single warning is enough to freeze planes on runways, empty hotel lobbies, and erase billions of yen in expected spending. At the same time, your favorite Japanese anime suddenly disappears from Chinese cinemas. A film you were waiting for quietly postpones its release. No one says ban out loud, but everyone understands what is happening. Welcome to a world where your holiday, your streaming queue, and your shopping list are no longer private choices. They are tools in a new kind of confrontation where states weaponize tourism and pop culture instead of tanks and artillery. If this script feels familiar, that's because it is. In 2016, Beijing already tested a version of this strategy on South Korea. Koreans now call it, half ironically, the Korea Limitation Order. The Korea Limitation Order was never a formal law. It was a mix of tour bans, show cancellations, safety inspections, and public messaging that together pressured Seoul over a missile defense system called THAAD. Today, many analysts wonder if we are watching the early stages of a new sequel, a Japan Limitation Order aimed at Tokyo, triggered not by THAAD, but by one sentence about Taiwan. This is the world of informal sanctions. No UN resolution, no official sanctions list. Just delays, warnings, and subtle guidance that make life and business harder, without ever using the word sanction. In this documentary, we ask 3 questions. What exactly happened during the Korea Limitation Order? What would a Japan Limitation Order look like? And most importantly, who really pays the price when economic coercion becomes routine? Ispanin. From Seoul to Tokyo to Beijing, East Asia has quietly become a laboratory for economic statecraft. Governments test how far they can push without firing a shot, and when business, tourists, and artists will finally push back. At the center of this new tension lies a small island with enormous symbolism, Taiwan. For Beijing, it is a core interest. For Japan, it is now described as a contingency that could threaten the very survival of the state. To understand what may be coming for Japan, we first need to rewind to the last time Beijing pulled this playbook from the shelf and turned Korea into a test case. In 2016, South Korea agreed with the United States to deploy THAAD, an advanced missile defense system, on Korean soil. Officially, it was aimed at North Korean missiles. Beijing saw something else. A powerful radar pointed at China. Chinese officials condemned the decision as a threat to regional stability. State media warned of consequences. But instead of announcing clear sanctions, Beijing reached for quieter, more flexible tools. Without a single new law, group tours from China to South Korea began to vanish. Travel agencies stopped selling packages. Charter flights were cut. Overnight, the busiest shopping streets in Seoul and Jeju became strangely calm. Cosmetic stores, duty-free counters, and restaurants that had lived off Chinese tourists suddenly faced empty aisles. Some estimates spoke of millions fewer visitors and billions of dollars in lost revenue over the following years. On Chinese screens, Korean dramas and K-pop idols faded. Variety shows were quietly dropped from schedules. Korean artists found concerts postponed indefinitely. Again, no official ban, just delays and unexplained decisions. One company, Lotte, paid a particularly heavy price. After it provided land for the THAAD site, many of its supermarkets in China suddenly failed safety inspections. Stores closed, projects were frozen. The message was clear to everyone. This was the Korea Limitation Order, not a statute you could read, but a web of informal measures. Tourism controls, media guidance, regulatory pressure, and public opinion campaigns all pulled in the same direction. For ordinary Koreans working in hotels, retail, entertainment, or construction, the effect was brutally simple. Fewer customers, fewer projects, and jobs at risk. Geopolitics suddenly walked through the front door of their workplaces. And something else changed. Surveys showed Korean public opinion towards China became sharply more negative. Many concluded, if Beijing can shut off our tourism and TV shows so easily, we need to rethink how much we depend on this relationship. Over the years, some of these pressures softened. Tourists slowly returned, joint productions reappeared, and officials talked about normalization. But the memory of the Korea Limitation Order never fully left Korean politics or business. What mattered most was the precedent. Beijing had shown it could use wallets instead of warheads, pop culture instead of missiles, to punish a neighbor's security decision, and do it without ever saying the word sanction. So when tensions rose again, this time with Japan, many in the region looked back to 2016 and asked a simple question. Is the Korea Limitation Order about to get a Japanese sequel? To answer that, we move from Seoul to Tokyo, from THAAD to Taiwan, and from one limitation order to the possibility of another. In 2025, Japan's new prime minister declared that if a Taiwan crisis directly threatened Japan's survival, Tokyo could exercise collective self-defense. For China, this sounded like a warning. Japan might join a conflict over Taiwan. Beijing reacted with fierce criticism, accusing Japan of crossing red lines and stirring up regional instability. Chinese commentators revived memories of wartime history and warned that Tokyo was playing with fire near Taiwan. Soon after, China issued travel warnings for Japan. Citizens were urged to exercise caution, be careful about safety, and think twice before traveling. The language was diplomatic. The effect on behavior was not. Major airlines began offering free refunds or changes for flights to Japan. Officially, it was a service decision, but for Japanese tourism, it looked like the familiar moment when the tap starts turning off. Airport check-in lines for Tokyo and Osaka started to thin. Shopping districts that had depended heavily on Chinese tour groups grew nervous. For many businesses, it felt disturbingly similar to the first days of the Korea Limitation Order. In China, some Japanese films and anime releases were quietly delayed or postponed for technical reasons. Promotions slowed. Schedules shifted. No one could say when or if the films would actually reach audiences. City-to-city exchanges, cultural festivals, and academic visits that had symbolized friendship between Chinese and Japanese communities began to be postponed until further notice. Soft ties, not just hard security, were being strained. On the other side, Japan's government advised its citizens in China to avoid large gatherings and be cautious, especially around political demonstrations. What started as a speech about Taiwan was now reshaping the daily routines of ordinary people. Online, Chinese social media filled with posts warning about crime and anti-China sentiment in Japan. Some called for boycotts of Japanese goods and travel. Others, more quietly, worried about losing their favorite destinations. In Japan, TV talk shows debated whether China was using tourism and culture as leverage. Small business owners asked if they should pivot to Southeast Asian visitors. Young fans wondered if anime and games would become political hostages. Out at sea, Chinese Coast Guard ships increased their presence near the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, rocks claimed by both Tokyo and Beijing. Drones and patrols there gave a hard-edged backdrop to the softer tools of travel and media pressure. Put together, these moves resemble a prototype of a Japan Limitation Order. Still softer than what Korea faced in 2016, but drawing from the same toolbox. Travel warnings, cultural delays, and heightened pressure around disputed territory. Samo, the question is not whether China can escalate, it is how far it is willing to push and at what cost before the pain it inflicts on others begins to come back home. To make sense of this, we need to talk about economic coercion. This is when a state uses trade, investment, tourism, or finance to try to change another state's political behavior without firing a single shot. The toolkit is broad. Travel alerts, ban on group tours, slow-walking import approvals, fines and inspections, pressure on companies, and quiet phone calls to broadcasters and tech platforms asking them to review foreign content. Imagine two columns on a screen. On the left, Korea in 2016. On the right, Japan in 2025. In both columns, we can tick the same boxes: tourism pressure, cultural content delays, official warnings, and nationalist media campaigns. Analysts often draw a scenario ladder. At the bottom is low-level signaling: warnings, cautionary press conferences, and subtle media framing. As you climb, measures become more disruptive and more costly for both sides. At the low stage, we see precisely what is happening now. Travel advisories, soft discouragement of trips, and early hints that cultural products may face technical difficulties. It sends a message but still leaves room to step back. At the mid-stage, group tours can be fully suspended, film and anime releases delayed on a large scale, and local government exchanges frozen. For tourism-dependent towns, this is the moment when the floor falls away. At the high stage, central authorities can issue programming guidance to broadcasters. encourage platforms to limit certain foreign content, and tighten customs checks on selected goods. The word boycott appears more often in headlines. At the extreme stage, states hint at or implement measures involving key raw materials or strategic components. For example, rare earths or advanced equipment. Even rumors of such moves can send shockwaves through global markets. Each step on the ladder hits different sectors. Low stages hit travel agencies and airlines first. Middle stages hit cinemas, streamers, and local governments. Higher stages start touching factories, ports, and multinational supply chains. Importantly, this ladder is not destiny. It is a scenario, not a prophecy. At any point, leaders can freeze escalation or bargain their way back down. But once you start climbing, it becomes politically harder to simply climb back down. Investors, meanwhile, are always watching. Each new warning, cancellation, or inspection adds one more data point to their mental map of risk. Over time, those dots form a simple pattern. Depending too much on any one market is dangerous. Charts and ladders can make economic coercion look abstract. In reality, each step on that ladder translates into canceled bookings, lost shifts, and quiet anxiety for workers and shop owners who had no say in foreign policy. So the key question becomes, if a Japan limitation order truly takes shape, who is structurally better positioned to absorb the pain, Japan or China? And what happens when both sides decide they can endure it longer than the other? In the next chapter, we look directly at the cost. First for Japan, then for China. Because in economic warfare, there are no free hits, only different kinds of damage. For Japan, the first visible hit would be in its tourist towns. Places like Osaka, Kyoto, and Hokkaido, where signs in Chinese and Korean line the shopping streets, and where local economies have come to depend on foreign visitors. Imagine a shop owner comparing photos from 2019 and 2025. In one, crowds of Chinese tour groups pose with tax-free shopping bags. In the other, the same street is half empty, with staff standing idle behind the counter. Fewer tourists mean lower sales taxes, smaller revenues for local governments, and less money for public services. For rural and coastal regions already struggling with aging populations, a sudden drop in tourism can feel like a slow bleed. Beyond tourism, Japanese companies still sell heavily into the Chinese market: cars, industrial equipment, electronics, and branded goods. A sharp swing in Chinese public sentiment can turn showroom floors into quiet, uncomfortable spaces. Japanese brands have seen this before. Boycotts over history or island disputes have periodically dented sales in China. A Japan limitation order would risk turning those periodic waves into a more permanent undercurrent of suspicion. In response, some Japanese firms are already shifting production and sales focus toward Southeast Asia, India, Europe, and North America. That diversification is insurance. But it also takes time and money and can't replace the Chinese market overnight. Politically, rising tension with China pushes Japan deeper into its alliance with the United States and closer coordination with Europe. That comes with its own costs: higher defense budgets, more strategic commitments, and domestic debates about remilitarization. In short, Japan faces a trade-off. It can stand firm on Taiwan and security issues, but it does so knowing that tourism, exports, and local jobs could be collateral damage. For many, the question is no longer if there will be pain, but who should carry it. Now, look from the other side. Japan is not a minor customer for China. It is one of Beijing's largest trading partners, a crucial buyer and supplier in everything from chemicals to machinery. Cutting ties would hurt both ways. In coastal Chinese cities, factories load ships bound for Yokohama and Nagoya. Components, tools, and consumer goods crisscross the East China Sea every day. A serious disruption in this flow would threaten not just foreign profits, but domestic jobs. Tourism cuts also hit Chinese workers. Travel agents, airline staff, hotel employees, and influencers who built careers around Japan, trips would see bookings disappear. What begins as pressure on Japan can quickly become unemployment at home. Then there is technology. Japan is a key supplier of machine tools, precision instruments, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment that Chinese industry still relies on. Losing easy access to these would not just be a short-term inconvenience. If Beijing escalates a Japan limitation order, Tokyo might respond by tightening export controls on sensitive technology in coordination with the United States and Europe. For China's long-term plans to climb the tech ladder, that is a serious risk. There is also a reputation cost. After episodes with Korea, Australia, and Lithuania, many governments already see China as willing to use economic leverage for political ends. Adding Japan to that list would harden this image even more. That hardened image feeds into a larger trend: de-risking. Governments and companies around the world are quietly reducing their dependence on China, not by cutting all ties, but by spreading production and supply chains across more countries. Ironically, a strong Japan limitation order might accelerate exactly what Beijing fears: a more tightly knit bloc of countries, including Japan, South Korea, the United States, and European states, coordinating technology, security, and trade policies against it. In that sense, the Japan limitation order would be a double-edged weapon. It might extract short-term concessions or send a powerful signal, but it could also sharpen the knives of containment and distrust pointing back at China. The key question for Beijing is simple and brutal. Is the psychological and political impact of pressuring Japan worth the long-term structural costs? Slower technological progress, deeper distrust, and a more hostile neighborhood. At this point, it is tempting to say all big powers do this. After all, the United States and European Union also use sanctions. But there is a crucial difference between transparent, legal sanctions and opaque, informal pressure. Formal sanctions are usually written down, debated, and sometimes challenged in courts and international bodies. Informal measures, like delayed approvals or sudden inspections, are harder to track, harder to contest, and easier to deny. Defenders of Beijing's approach argue that every state has the right to decide where its citizens travel, which shows are broadcast, and which products enter its markets. They see these measures as a form of legitimate self-defense. Critics respond that when such choices are clearly tied to another country's political decisions, like deploying missile defense or speaking about Taiwan, they cross the line into economic coercion, undermining the norms of open trade. This is why groups like the G7 and the European Union are now building tools explicitly designed to respond to economic coercion. They worry that if such tactics spread unchecked, the world trading system could slowly fragment into rival camps. There is also a more basic question: do sanctions and informal pressure actually work? In many cases, targeted countries do not reverse their policies. Instead, they diversify their markets, tighten alliances, and grow more suspicious of the sender. In South Korea's case, the THAAD deployment stayed. What changed most was public sentiment: more skepticism toward China, more support for strong ties with the United States, and a deeper conversation about over-reliance on any single partner. A similar pattern could emerge in Japan. Economic pressure over Taiwan might not soften Tokyo's stance. It might instead strengthen voices arguing that the country must rearm, deepen alliances, and reduce economic exposure to China. If that happens, economic coercion becomes a boomerang. The more it is thrown, the more it returns as a tighter ring of skeptical neighbors, each quietly planning how to live with China while also protecting themselves from China. To be fair, China is not alone. Western sanctions have also devastated economies and hurt civilians, as often with mixed results. The ethical problem is not unique to one country. It is embedded in a global system where power and principle often collide. But what makes these new limitation orders distinct is how intimately they reach into personal life. They don't just target elites or banks, they reshape where you can travel, what you can watch, and what jobs are available in your hometown. Before we judge any one government, we should remember that we are all in some way part of this system. As tourists, consumers, voters, and workers, our expectations, fears, and choices also influence how far leaders can go. Think of a Chinese student who dreamed of studying in Tokyo, or a Japanese student who wanted to explore Shanghai. For them, limitation orders are not abstract geopolitics. They are the quiet erasure of a personal path that once seemed open. Or consider a factory worker in Tianjin whose job depends on parts shipped to Japan, and a shop clerk in Osaka whose job depends on Chinese tourists. They may never meet, but both live at the intersection of politics and paychecks. In another corner of the internet, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese fans still share fan art and memes about the same anime, games, and idols. Even as governments quarrel, shared fandoms quietly remind us that culture does not recognize neat borders. Yet the ghost of the Korea limitation order still haunts the region. It whispers that any cultural bridge built today can be burned tomorrow by a strategic decision far away from the people who enjoy it. a full Japan limitation order may or may not materialize. But the logic behind it, using economic pressure to shape political choices, is already shaping how companies invest, how governments speak, and how ordinary people plan their lives. If you live in Korea, Japan, China, or anywhere connected to their economies, this is not just a story about them. It is, in some sense, a story about you, your job, your savings, your freedom to move and to imagine. So we end with a question, not an answer. Is using travel, trade, and culture as weapons a legitimate way to defend national interests? Or does it mark the slow erosion of a world in which people, not states, choose how they connect? From the Korea limitation order to the possible Japan limitation order, East Asia is testing the limits of economic pressure as a foreign policy tool. The outcome will not only shape this region, it will shape how all of us live in a weaponized global economy.